Did Rand Paul just give the most important foreign policy speech of our lifetime?
But, I think on 2016, by the way, I'd love to see Jeb. I'd love to see Chris Christie. I think Paul Ryan would be a great candidate. The one person I don't want to see is somebody like a Rand Paul who's put out budgets to cut the military in half. I think that would be devastating for our party right now.
It's interesting because that argument right there is, if you look at the military budget of the United States compared to the rest of the world, it's dumbfounding. The amount of money and the resources that we put into military. And if we cut it in half, we would still have the mightiest military and the most expensive military in the world. So is that such a bad thing, Jack?
Let's talk about the stupidity, and that's Representative Adam Kinzinger of California's statement that he made. This is a Republican, guys. Okay, so everything you just said is true, Kurt. If we cut our military budget in half right now, that would take us about, it's either 2004 or 2006 levels of spending on our military. I don't remember Republicans in 2004 and 2006 saying that we were extremely underfunded and Bush was killing the military and, we're all going to die, whatever the hell else. Devastating is the word he used. I don't remember that. Let's get to Rand Paul specifically. So Rand Paul did call for Pentagon cuts, as he called for all sorts of cuts in our government that would save us about $500 billion a year, one of the first budgets he proposed. Well, that never passed. And he had, I think Jim DeMint voted for that budget. Mike Lee, apparently Kinzinger thinks they're anti-military. No, we just need to cut and we need to be smarter about how we spend our money. Okay. After that budget, we have the sequester. The sequester was the automatic cuts that went across the board, and they were sloppy cuts. They were a horrible way to cut government. They need to be more specific. The Congress is so irresponsible, they enacted these automatic cuts. Guess who voted for the sequester? Adam Kinzinger. He voted for that. He supported that. Okay, so Rand Paul introduces a bill later on that restores all the cuts made in the sequester and cuts in other places. So this sequester that Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney said, Obama's slashing the military, which all the Republicans agreed with at the time, including Kinzinger, Rand Paul tried to fix that. He said, this is a sloppy way to cut. This is a bad way to cut military. Let's fix that. That didn't pass either. Long story short, Kinzinger's lying about Rand Paul's record on this. He's lying about to the degree that we don't need the cut. And I'll go furthermore, Kurt. When Republicans say we need to reform our public education system and get rid of the Department of Education and reform it, the first thing Democrats say is that Republicans are going to devastate education. We hear that, right? When Republicans want to reform entitlements, Paul Ryan, remember, he had that plan to reform entitlements. Democrats show grandma being pushed off a cliff. Republicans are going to devastate Social Security and Medicare. Republicans want to devastate the poor by getting rid of certain welfare programs. You see what I'm getting at. Democrats say every time that Republicans want to cut, reform, scale back, that we have to have the size of government we have right now, and not only that it needs to get bigger, and anything that goes in the opposite direction is devastating. We want to starve the poor. The Republicans hate women, whatever the hell it is. So Kinzinger is the Republican version of that. Rand Paul, who is a strict constitutional, limited government conservative, who wants to cut everything on our government and scale it back. We need government, but to make it smaller than it is now, what does he do? Rand Paul would devastate our military. There's no difference between Adam Kinzinger and his rhetoric and Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Barack Obama, and they could dance around it, beat their chest, point at ISIS, whatever the hell they want to do, but there's not one damn difference.
The title of the segment is, did Rand Paul just give the most important foreign policy speech of our lifetime?
Yes,
and that's what this is his reaction to that. And it is probably the most important speech that I've heard him give. There are some things that I take caution about, and I think other libertarians and people that are cautious about what we've seen over the last 13 years. And I'll give you an example. He talks about American interests. Now, that might be pandering to our neoconservative friends or our warhawk friends, but that is something that has to be defined. You have to clarify, what is our American interest in terms of going and taking military action and defending our American interests? What is that? And so that's probably the one area of the speech that I wasn't sure about. And there are things like that I think people like myself that have always been cautious, but Would I vote for Rand Paul? Unless one of us goes crazy, yeah, I'll vote for Rand Paul, because he is very sober and he's very thoughtful, and he understands liberty, and he understands that you only use military force for defense.
Right. I think anybody of our perspective who didn't vote for Rand Paul is foolish. And I don't mean as an insult to you, but let me explain why. One take on the speech that Rand Paul gave last Thursday at the Center for the National Interest, which was founded by Richard Nixon. It was a foreign policy institute here in Washington, D.C. Zach Beauchamp at Vox wrote a piece called "Rand Paul just gave one of the most important foreign policy speeches in decades." Now, the point he makes is not that Rand was necessarily saying anything different that he said in the past, though I think he's probably said it better and is a little bit more clear, but that he's making it clear that he is trying to challenge the entire bipartisan foreign policy consensus that exists on the left and the right, and most certainly in the Republican Party. Zach Beauchamp is making the point that Rand Paul, instead of trying to, as many libertarians think he might, or as critics on the left thinks he might, sort of being more like a Bush or Obama or a Hillary Clinton on foreign policy, is going in the exact opposite direction. I think the term that Beauchamp uses, he's going to, instead of becoming part of the consensus, he's going to take a battering ram against that consensus. The trick for Rand Paul, and this is what he got to in his speech, we all agree, sensible people, when I say all, I'm talking about me and you and people like Rand Paul and, libertarians who think about liberty, we all agree that our foreign policy is broken, that we need less intervention, that the things that we've been doing not only don't work, but have caused more problems than they're worth, and on top of it, we can't afford it. So how do you take that recognition and make it work in real-world terms? A pure libertarian would say, well, we get rid of NATO immediately, we don't do anything anytime. Rand Paul is saying we do have to do some things some of the time. We need a strong military, but about a tenth of what we're doing right now, a hell of a lot less of what we're doing right now. When we do it, we should do it constitutionally. That is so far, in a way, different from what George W. Bush stood for and what Barack Obama stood for and what most Republicans in the GOP think right now as far as the leadership is concerned. I think the rank and file is a little different. That would be revolutionary. And, getting back to our conversation before this about Kinzinger, if we as libertarians or conservatives really believe in the small government stuff that Republicans run their mouths about every time they campaign, you can't get to a smaller, more constitutional government if you think the foreign policy we have right now is the way to go. We need to maintain it and possibly expand it. It is mathematically impossible. Rand Paul, that was an aspect of his speech. He addresses the cost issues and talks about Mike Mullen, former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, brought up that, our national debt is the greatest threat to our national security. That's absolutely true. The trick for Rand Paul is to make people understand that he recognizes there are threats in the world and there are global challenges, and if he decides to run for president, he would be able to meet them. But also to understand that most of the things, a majority of the things that the establishment of both parties have portrayed as threats in the past were not. And we waste a lot of human sacrifice, a lot of dollars, and a lot of time in sort of being involved in things we shouldn't have been involved in to begin with. Now,
on the right, there was an article that just came out on Breitbart called "It's America's Fault." Rand Paul. It's America's fault.
I could barely get to the end. It was so stupid.
Yeah, Sebastian Gorka wrote this article. Now, his argument is, and this is a legitimate concern for Americans, we have a problem with Islamic hatred towards America. Now, Rand Paul addresses that, but this is kind of picking and choosing out of his speech, and I'm going to go ahead and play devil's advocate here. He talks about that we don't have an Islam problem, we have a dignity problem. And with millions of men and women across the Middle East being treated as chattel by their own governments. Now, this really incites some frustration. It sounds like he's dismissing Islam, Jack.
You're talking about Rand Paul.
It sounds like Rand Paul's dismissing that element in those
radical
words.
Islam's a problem, and he's never disputed that. And I don't think he does that in the speech, but he's just talking about there are situations on the ground that no military can solve. And that's something that the guy, I can't remember the guy that wrote that, Rand Paul Blames America or whatever the hell it was, doesn't even begin to understand. Mm-hmm. There are situations on the ground in Syria and Iraq sort of give rise to groups like ISIS and whatnot that there are no military solutions to. I think Rand Paul used the term dignity, the dignity on the streets and whatnot. That's true. And to the degree that we think that we can fix that with armies and occupying forces that stay there for decades on end, we're going to lose. We're not going to accomplish anything. I think we've seen that in Iraq. I think we've seen that to a large degree in Afghanistan, and we would see it if we want to do it in Iraq all over again. People who say, you blame America, most conservatives I know think that government action creates a human reaction when it comes to taxes, when it comes to how they regulate, things in your front yard, the local neighborhood community group. Mm-hmm. It is a conservative axiom that government action creates a human reaction. For some reason, many conservatives think that applies to everything the state does except the most violent and oppressive thing any state can do, which is go to war. I'm sorry, there is a such thing as blowback. It's a term the CIA invented. I didn't invent it. And it is not the answer to everything. I disagree with some libertarians. I don't think that's everything. Radical Islam is definitely a component. Mm-hmm. But the idea that you can go to war with countries for decades on end and bomb people and kill lots of innocent civilians and not think people are going to be angry with you and use drone strikes and not think that that's going to recruit terrorists, as Malala Yousafzai, I can never say her last name, has recently said even to President Obama, is foolish. And to the degree that we want to be foolish and beat our chests and say Rand Paul's blaming America, we're going to keep having these problems.
And we have to look at history too. That Democrats have gotten into a lot of the wars, and that somehow switched with Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. And now Democrats are keeping us in wars. To me, this is a globalism, liberal foreign policy position. It always has seemed that way to me. That this is something that liberals will go along with. That liberals actually endorsed up until the Republicans started endorsing it. And it's like the Republicans were taken over by this kind of liberal neoconservative belief system on foreign policy.
Right. Neoconservatism is basically applying liberal principles to foreign policy. In domestic policy, we say, this government program doesn't work. It costs too much. It's ineffective. Let's get rid of it. Let's do something different with it. Well, our foreign policy has cost too much. It's ineffective. It hasn't done much. And what do neoconservatives say? We got to do more of it. Just keep the course. Keep doing it. Keep doing the same thing. It's exactly what it is. To the degree that there ever was an anti-war left, we know that that's generally not true. They were anti-Bush's wars. They have no problem with Obama's wars. I think what Rand Paul would offer, and why his speech was so important, he would offer, as Zach Beauchamp said, sort of a revolutionarily different, I don't know, revolutionarily is a word, but a very, very different Republican Party. And quite frankly, he'd offer an alternative to principled progressives who, think that civil liberties are important and that a more sane foreign policy is their priority. I think you'd see a very interesting and different election in 2016 if he were to run. There's
one thing that I loved about Senator Paul's speech, and he did this at the Value Voters speech as well, where he talked about the importance of allowing, by not undermining, the people of Islam to purge themselves of this radical element, to work with them, to join hands together in supporting them, because they are the ones that are going to have to get rid of these people.
That's right.
We're not going to be able to do that. It's just impossible.
That's the only way it's going to work. And I think, sober foreign policy people, some of whom hopefully will be surrounding Rand Paul, get that. I think the foreign policy establishment in both the Republican and Democratic parties don't care to get that, and if they do, they don't really care about it. They have their agenda, and they're going to keep doing things the way they've been done.
Jack, we're at the end of the show. It's been another great one.
Always good to talk to you, Kurt. Thank you.
You can follow us on Twitter @Rare Report, and you can also like us on Facebook, facebook.com/Rare Report.